On Maplewood Lane, where lawns were trimmed into obedience and cars gleamed in driveways like trophies of middle-class survival, the Carneys looked, at first glance, like a family who had figured things out. Michael, 46, held a steady job at a regional insurance company, regional being the polite term for, not quite important, not quite invisible. Susan, 2 years younger, worked part-time at the public library, her paycheck modest but her sense of contribution quietly essential. Their daughter, Emma, 16, was sharp enough to get into any college if she could corral her cynicism into something constructive, and their son Noah, 11, still possessed the earnestness of a boy who believed family dinners were sacred. The neighbors, waving from across the cul-de-sac, saw nothing but steadiness. Susan's well-tended garden, Michael's habit of washing the car every Sunday, the children biking in circles after school. Only within the house did the texture change. The cracks weren't cinematic, no screaming matches audible through walls, no dishes hurled across the kitchen. They were smaller, subtler, the kind of fissures that begin as hairlines in a foundation and widen over years until one day the floor groans underfoot. Take mornings. Susan liked silence with her coffee. Michael, who hated silence as much as he hated lukewarm coffee, filled it with sports radio or weather updates. She would stare at him across the table, not angrily, but with the detached expression of someone watching a faucet drip, drip, drip. He, sensing the chill, would comment on Noah's math homework or Emma's college prep, searching for common ground that felt increasingly like a minefield. Or evenings. Once they had cooked together, Michael chopping onions while Susan stirred sauce, the smell of garlic binding them in invisible intimacy. Now he lingered at work under the excuse of emails, and she plated dinner alone. When he did arrive, conversation was practical. Schedules, bills, whether the dog needed shots. Their words were tools, not gestures of affection. Emma noticed. Teenagers are accused of self-absorption, but her self-absorption was threaded with vigilance. She saw her mother's shoulders stiffen when her father kissed her cheek hello. She heard the tone, just a shade too brisk, in which he asked about Susan's day. Emma responded by retreating into sarcasm, the language of someone who cares too much to be earnest. Noah noticed, too, but differently. For him, the silences were puzzles he tried to solve with chatter. He described his video games, his school projects, the new boy who sat next to him in math. His parents smiled and nodded, grateful for the noise, but he felt the effort behind their smiles. A child can tell the difference between ease and performance. The marriage wasn't loveless, that would have been easier. It was full of tiny debts and unacknowledged disappointments. Susan felt Michael had become incurious, his conversation revolving around work grievances and the minor politics of his office. Michael felt Susan had grown brittle, measuring out warmth like teaspoons of sugar, never generous. Both remembered the early years, those long nights of conversation, the thrill of discovering a private language, but memory became less a source of comfort than of indictment. If we had it once, why not now? There were arguments, yes, but they rarely flared. They simmered. A remark about the electricity bill spiraled into reproach about spending habits. A complaint about his late hours curdled into accusations of avoidance. They fought like people who feared escalation more than they feared the truth, so they circled, jabbed, retreated. The children learned to leave the room when voices sharpened, though sometimes Emma lingered at the door, daring herself to listen. One Saturday, in the bright sterility of the kitchen, Susan asked Michael to fix the broken cabinet hinge. He promised, distracted. Weeks passed. She asked again, and he bristled. He was tired, he had deadlines, couldn't she call someone? She stood there, cloth in hand, and said, "It's not about the hinge." He opened his mouth to respond, then shut it. Because what could he say? That everything felt like it wasn't about what it was about. That each demand carried a freight of unmet longing? At night, lying inches apart in bed, the air between them was charged with all the words unsaid. Sometimes Susan longed to reach for him, but pride froze her arm. Sometimes Michael considered apologizing, but the fear of rejection weighed heavier than his guilt. So they turned onto their sides, backs parallel, two figures in a tableau of distance. The cracks widened in public, too, though more discreetly. At Emma's school recital, Susan clapped with exaggerated brightness, while Michael checked his phone between pieces. In the parking lot afterward, Emma said, "You could at least pretend to care." Michael snapped back, "I was there, wasn't I?" Susan said nothing, which was worse. On Maplewood Lane, appearances remained intact. The Carneys still attended block parties, still posed for holiday photos in coordinated sweaters. But behind the smiles, each carried private calculations. Michael wondered if other men his age felt this invisible erosion, the quiet sense that something essential had slipped away. Susan, shelving books at the library, envied the fictional couples who quarreled with passion, because passion at least implied desire. The house itself began to reflect their state. The paint on the porch peeled. The garden grew weeds Susan didn't bother to pull. Michael noticed but said nothing, because he had stopped believing in repairs. The house still stood, but like the marriage, it sagged at the edges. And yet, despite everything, they kept moving forward. School drop-offs, grocery runs, tax season, as if momentum itself were the glue. Only occasionally, in moments of unguarded stillness, did either of them glimpse the truth. That what bound them was less love than habit, less choice than inertia. Emma, journaling late at night, wrote one line that she never showed anyone. "My parents are like two people in a boat with a leak. Instead of bailing water, they argue about whose turn it is to row." Noah, kneeling at his bedside to pray, though his faith was vague, more wishful than doctrinal, whispered, "Please let them smile at each other tomorrow." The cracks were there, undeniable, yet still deniable, small enough to ignore, large enough to unsettle. A marriage, after all, doesn't collapse in one blow. It frays. It accumulates hairline fractures until one day, almost casually, it breaks. And though none of them could name it yet, the Carneys were already living in the aftershocks of a ruin that hadn't quite arrived. It didn't happen in a single fight, though later, when people asked Michael or Susan what exactly had led to the end, each of them could point to a particular argument as if it were the breaking point. But the truth was more complicated and less cinematic. The separation was the slow accretion of moments too small to notice until they calcified into something unmovable, like the mineral deposit around a faucet you keep meaning to clean until one day you realize it's become a crust. There had been an argument in late October about the car. Michael left the gas tank empty again. Susan had to rush to work with the warning light blinking, and by the time she made it to the school library, she was already late for her morning meeting. She came home that evening furious, but instead of yelling, she delivered her anger in a way that was even worse. Calm, almost rehearsed, laying out the evidence of years of negligence. "It's never about the gas, Michael," she said. "It's about the fact that you never look past yourself." He, stung, responded with sarcasm. "Right, because you've been living with a saint all these years." Neither apologized. A week later, the issue was money. Emma's piano lessons, Noah's orthodontist bills, the kitchen roof that leaked every heavy rain. They argued in the kitchen with the television on in the background, the kids pretending not to hear from upstairs. Susan accused him of being careless, always assuming the numbers would sort themselves out. Michael, defensive, snapped back that she hoarded every penny as if they were living through the Great Depression. It ended with him leaving the room, slamming the door harder than he meant to. It was in December, after weeks of minor skirmishes, that Susan announced, without drama, "I think we should separate." She said it while folding laundry, as if it were a pragmatic suggestion, like buying a new washer. Michael looked up from his phone, momentarily stunned, and then laughed, a short, harsh laugh, as though the absurdity of it required ridicule. But she didn't retract it. She placed a folded towel on the pile and repeated, "I mean it. I don't think this is working anymore." What followed was not shouting but a long, bitter silence. The silence itself was its own kind of violence, filling the house with a charged stillness that was somehow louder than yelling. The kids noticed, of course. Emma, who was 14 and quick with her judgments, told her best friend that her parents were, basically divorced already. Noah, only 10, retreated into video games, where the families on screen never seemed to fight, only to respawn and keep going. The logistics of the separation were as unromantic as the decision. Michael agreed to move out first, renting a one-bedroom apartment on the south side of town with beige carpet and a view of a parking lot. The first night he slept there, surrounded by boxes of clothes and books he hadn't unpacked. He felt like a college student again, except heavier, lonelier, and without the sense of future that made being 20 bearable. He microwaved leftover Chinese food, scrolled aimlessly through streaming options, and finally went to bed at 9, staring at the ceiling for hours. Susan, back at the house, discovered that the quiet she had once craved felt oppressive when it actually arrived. She told herself she would enjoy not having to cook dinner for 4 every night, not having to fold his socks, not having to endure his sighs when she corrected his forgetfulness. But the house was suddenly too large, the refrigerator echoing with emptiness, the bed an expanse she didn't know what to do with. She left the TV on in the evenings, just for the noise. The children split their time between households. Emma was old enough to resent the arrangement openly, telling both parents that shuttling back and forth was humiliating. Noah didn't complain, but he carried his backpack like a burden heavier than schoolbooks, stuffed with the small objects that tethered him to each place. His favorite sweatshirt, a handheld console, the blanket that smelled faintly of home. The holidays made everything worse. At Thanksgiving, Susan cooked a turkey just for herself and the kids, the absence at the head of the table unspoken but glaring. Michael, at his sister's house 2 towns over, tried to pass the time with cousins he hadn't seen in years, sipping wine too quickly and feeling like a guest in his own life. Christmas was worse. They agreed to split the day, Michael in the morning, Susan in the afternoon, as if carving up not just time but affection. Noah cried when Michael left after lunch, the boy trying to hide his tears but failing. Emma rolled her eyes at the whole charade, pretending cynicism to disguise her own hurt. And yet, amid the bleakness, there were small, guilty moments of relief. Susan noticed she could read in the evenings without interruption, that she no longer had to clean up his shoes from the hallway. Michael relished the freedom of eating cereal for dinner without judgment, of leaving the TV remote exactly where he wanted it. Both felt, in flashes, the perverse thrill of living as individuals again, not halves of a decaying unit. But the relief was thin and easily pierced. For every evening Susan enjoyed her solitude, there was a night when she reached instinctively for the other side of the bed and found only cold sheets. For every moment Michael relished his autonomy, there was an evening when he came home to an empty apartment and realized no one on earth cared whether he had made it back safely. Their friends reacted with varying degrees of surprise. Some said they had seen it coming, others acted blindsided. A few offered sympathetic clichés about new beginnings and finding yourself. Michael found himself irritated by the well-meaning pity, the way people treated divorce like a self-help project. Susan, meanwhile, clung to the routines of school, grading papers late into the night, grateful for the mindless busyness that kept her from dwelling on what she had lost. The children adapted in ways that were both resilient and heartbreaking. Emma developed a new sarcasm that seemed designed to inoculate herself against pain. "At least I'll have 2 sets of birthday presents now," she told a classmate, the bitterness in her tone sharper than she realized. Noah became quieter, his teachers noting that he seemed distracted, his grades slipping. One night, when Susan went to tuck him in, he asked softly, "When will Dad come home again?" She didn't know what to say, so she kissed his forehead and turned off the light. The separation stretched into the new year, and with it came a sense of permanence. What had begun as a trial arrangement began to feel fixed, like a cast around a broken bone that you almost forget is there until it itches unbearably. Michael settled into his apartment, buying a cheap couch and a second-hand dining table, filling the space with objects that made it look less like exile and more like residence. Susan rearranged the living room at home, moving furniture not because she needed to but because she could, as if declaring the space her own. Still, neither of them used the word divorce openly, at least not yet. It hovered between them like a question they were too tired to answer. They avoided each other as much as possible, communication reduced to logistics about the children. Drop-off times, school events, who was paying for what. Each email or text carried the polite chill of strangers forced into correspondence. And yet, beneath the silence, each harbored a complicated tangle of emotions: resentment, yes, but also regret, longing, and the stubborn hope that maybe the other would make the first move toward reconciliation. But pride and fear kept them locked in place, like two climbers on opposite cliffs, each waiting for the other to build the bridge. The separation, then, was not merely physical. It was emotional, spiritual, atmospheric. The air in their old house felt different, heavier somehow, as if it carried the memory of arguments. The apartment felt sterile, a place for survival rather than living. What they had lost was not just each other's company but the texture of shared existence, the background noise of a life built together, the small, unremarkable gestures that once made up the fabric of intimacy. It was only later, months into the distance, that they began to understand. The separation wasn't the clean break they thought it would be. It was messier, more ambiguous, more painful than either had imagined. For all their efforts to live apart, they remained entangled in ways neither could escape. And for the children, the fault line running through the family widened daily, leaving them to balance on the edge, hoping it wouldn't split further. Michael's apartment was neither small nor large, though in the early weeks it felt cavernous, like a warehouse with echoes. He had chosen it quickly, a two-bedroom in a building meant for young professionals, with brushed steel appliances and laminate flooring that imitated wood without convincing anyone. The walls were beige, which suited his intentions: neutral, unobtrusive, a place to wait out the humiliation of being separated at 45. He bought a futon because it was cheap, assembled it badly, and woke most mornings with his back aching in a way that made him feel older than he already did. The second bedroom, theoretically meant for the kids, contained a pair of inflatable mattresses and a lamp rescued from Susan's garage purge. Emma, 14, eyed the setup with scorn during her first overnight visit. Noah, 9, was less critical, more eager to make the best of things, though his politeness stung Michael more than Emma's hostility. Evenings alone became an education in the limits of television. He'd imagined catching up on documentaries, rediscovering the movies he'd missed during years of family obligations. Instead he found himself scrolling through streaming menus until fatigue won. There was something embarrassing about realizing he had no real tastes of his own, that most of his preferences had been absorbed through Susan's choices or the children's needs. Susan's house, once their house, retained its equilibrium better, though she too discovered absences in every corner. The dinner table felt off balance without Michael's weary but reliable presence. She began to eat standing up, leaning against the counter, as though by refusing to set a place she could disguise the vacancy. The bed was larger, colder. She experimented with new routines: late-night walks, podcasts in her earbuds, long grocery store trips where she wandered every aisle. To friends she spoke briskly, saying she was adjusting, that the space was refreshing. In truth, she was startled by how easily solitude slid into loneliness, and how the silence of the house seemed not restful but accusatory. The children performed their own adaptations. Emma developed a habit of keeping her bedroom door closed, earphones in, her phone a barrier between herself and parental concern. She had witnessed the bickering long enough to believe she preferred the split, yet she also noticed, though she would not have admitted it, that her sense of home had fractured irreparably. Noah, shuttling between two households with a backpack and stuffed animals, mastered the art of cheerful compliance. He spoke in updates. "Dad's fridge has nothing but mustard," or "Mom's car smells like lavender now." His role as reporter concealed the unease of never quite belonging anywhere. Holidays exposed the rawness. Thanksgiving was divided. Thursday with Susan, Friday with Michael. The turkey at her house came with family rituals. His attempt on Friday involved takeout from a diner and an apologetic laugh. Christmas morning was parceled by the clock, wrapping paper strewn in two different living rooms. Each parent smiled harder than usual, disguising the exhaustion of pretending the division was not a wound. Michael dated briefly, encouraged by colleagues who spoke of apps as if they were a miracle cure. The profiles he swiped through belonged to women with hobbies he didn't share, or glossy smiles that seemed immune to disappointment. His two actual dates were awkward. One woman who talked endlessly about her Pilates instructor, another who asked, after 30 minutes, whether he was still in love with his ex-wife. The answer lodged in his throat, unspoken but obvious. He deleted the app and returned to nights with takeout containers and a guilty glass of bourbon. Susan, meanwhile, was courted gently by Mark Penner, an old acquaintance from the library committee. Widowed, courteous, careful not to intrude, he invited her to coffee under the pretext of discussing book donations. She accepted twice, feeling both flattered and unsettled. Mark's attention reminded her that she was visible, desirable even, yet every conversation drifted toward comparisons she did not voice. He wasn't Michael. He lacked the familiar irritations, but also the familiar rhythm, the inside jokes, the shorthand of years, the tiny compass points of shared life. As months stretched, both Michael and Susan confronted the futility of distractions. Work absorbed them to a point. Michael immersed in spreadsheets, Susan cataloging new arrivals at the library, but evenings had a way of stripping defenses. The absence of another body brushing past in the kitchen, the lack of a voice to announce the mail, the simple business of existing in parallel with someone, all this surfaced as loss. Michael began to notice, almost with shame, the habits he'd once resented in Susan. Her precise way of folding laundry, her insistence on planning meals a week ahead. In his apartment the laundry stayed crumpled, meals were improvisations. He recognized, dimly, that his independence was a fiction. Much of his life had been scaffolded by her invisible labor. Susan, for her part, discovered that she missed Michael's predictability. She had complained often of his inertia, his tendency to retreat into the couch after dinner. Yet without him, evenings became shapeless. She read novels half-heartedly, abandoned them midway. She tried yoga videos, baked bread, rearranged furniture. None of it filled the gap left by the absence of someone to roll his eyes, to mutter a joke, to simply exist in the same space. The children absorbed these subtleties. Emma began writing poems, bleak, sarcastic lines she hid in notebooks but which teachers glimpsed and praised. Noah developed stomachaches that sent him to the nurse's office, ailments without cause. Both carried, in different ways, the recognition that their parents were lonelier than they admitted. The distance was not just measured in miles between two addresses, but in the gradual erosion of confidence. Each parent told themselves the separation was necessary, perhaps permanent. Yet both, in moments of fatigue, allowed the thought that maybe it had been salvageable, that the fights were less about betrayal than about the accumulation of silence. One evening in late winter, Michael found himself driving past the old house. Lights glowed in the living room. Through the window he saw Susan reading on the couch, Noah sprawled with Legos at her feet. The scene pierced him, not because he wanted to intrude, but because it revealed how life carried on without him. He sat in the car until the cold seeped through the windshield, then drove away with the uncomfortable realization that he was missing more than a marriage. He was missing the texture of family, the messy continuity he had once taken for granted. Susan, too, had her moment. She overheard Emma on the phone with a friend, saying in a casual tone, "It's like we don't really have a family anymore, just two places we stay." The remark, tossed off by a teenager, lodged in Susan's chest. That night she dreamed of a dinner table intact, Michael carving turkey, Emma rolling her eyes, Noah telling jokes. She woke with tears on her pillow, startled by the force of her longing. By spring, the initial bravado of independence had thinned. What remained was a muted ache, a recognition that freedom was lonelier than confinement. The routines they had abandoned now appeared in memory not as shackles but as rituals of belonging. And so, without speaking, without even knowing it, Michael and Susan began to inhabit the same emotional terrain. The slow recognition of what they had lost was not passion or romance, not the cinematic fireworks of early love, but the prosaic, sustaining companionship of everyday life. The weight of a body in the bed, the arguments over gas tanks, the laughter that arrived unannounced. All the small, irreplaceable threads that, once severed, left them drifting further from the fabric they had once woven together. It was Emma who finally forced them back into the same room. Not in the way Susan might have feared. a teenage pregnancy or a brush with the law, but through the kind of ordinary collapse that makes you realize how fragile a child can be even when nothing spectacular has gone wrong. Emma was 14 now, smart and brittle, one of those girls who could shift in a second between the eye-rolling cynicism she'd learned from TikTok and the raw, unedited sobs of someone still closer to childhood than adulthood. Her grades had been slipping all year, but Susan thought she could manage it with extra supervision, some tough love, the occasional grounding. It wasn't until the school counselor called. Emma had broken down crying in the middle of a math test, insisting she couldn't breathe, that the scope of things became clear. The counselor suggested a joint meeting. Both parents present, if possible. That phrase landed in Susan's inbox like a summons. She forwarded it to Michael with only a terse note, "We should both go." The counselor's office was small, almost claustrophobic, a circle of low chairs and a fake ficus tree in the corner. Emma sat hunched, sleeves pulled down over her hands, refusing to look at either parent. Michael and Susan occupied their own separate orbits, careful not to let knees or elbows graze. "She's under an unusual amount of stress," the counselor said, voice trained into a soothing neutrality. "Not just academically, but emotionally. Children often carry more of their parents' conflicts than we realize." It was the word conflicts that made Emma snap. "Just say it. They hate each other. That's what you mean." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to buzz. Susan's face flushed. Michael looked down at his shoes. Emma's words weren't entirely accurate. Hate was too strong, too absolute. But they cut because they contained a shard of truth. Susan forced herself to speak. "We don't hate each other, Emma. We..." She stopped, unsure of the rest of the sentence. "We what? We tolerate? We manage the logistics of your lives while trying not to remember our own?" Michael cleared his throat. "Your mom's right. We don't hate each other." He glanced sideways at Susan, and for a brief second she caught something she hadn't seen in years. The tentative appeal in his eyes, as if asking her to confirm that statement for herself as much as for their daughter. Afterward, in the parking lot, Michael surprised her by waiting. Susan assumed he'd bolt, but there he was, leaning against his car, hands shoved in his pockets. "She's worse off than I thought," he said quietly. "She's been holding it in," Susan admitted. "I kept telling myself it was just a phase." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind cut across the lot, sharp and cold. Then Michael said, almost reluctantly, "Maybe we need to try harder. At least with how we deal with each other." The words should have irritated her, coming years too late, but instead she felt the strange ache of recognition. They had both failed Emma, not through one grand betrayal, but through the slow erosion of their ability to speak without anger, to share space without tension. "Try harder," Susan repeated, testing the phrase like a bitter pill. "We've tried before, not for us, for them." He meant Emma and Noah. She couldn't argue with that. Trying harder meant logistics at first. Coordinating drop-offs instead of exchanging kids in silence at the curb. Sitting together, however stiffly, during Noah's basketball games. Attending Emma's parent-teacher conference as a pair rather than two halves of a fractured whole. What surprised Susan was how awkward it felt, even more than when they'd first separated. Being near Michael reminded her of all the old rhythms, but in a distorted way, like returning to your childhood home and finding the ceilings lower than you remembered. One night after Noah's game, the four of them ended up at a diner. Emma poked at her fries. Noah recounted a missed layup with dramatic gestures. Susan noticed Michael listening intently, laughing in the right spots, and for a second she saw him not as her ex-husband but as the father her children still loved. When the kids went to the restroom, she and Michael were left alone in the booth. The silence pressed. Finally he said, "You look tired." It was such an ordinary comment that it startled her. Once upon a time he'd said it weakly, sometimes with annoyance, sometimes with concern. Now it felt like the faintest thread stretched across an abyss. "I am tired," she admitted. "Always tired." He nodded, eyes softening. No solution offered, no joke deflecting the truth. Just acknowledgement, and oddly, it eased something in her chest. Still, the reckoning wasn't tidy. Old wounds resurfaced like debris after a storm. There was the night Michael dropped the kids late, Susan already fuming from a 12-hour day at work. You could at least text, she snapped. I lost track, he said, and she heard in his tone the same casualness that had once made her feel invisible. You always lose track, of time, of money, of... She stopped before the word me slipped out. Michael's face hardened. Don't start. The children, sensing the escalation, went silent in the kitchen. Susan bit back her reply, swallowing the anger until it burned. That night she lay awake thinking, trying harder is not the same as healing. We can't just patch holes in a sinking ship. What neither of them admitted aloud was how lonely they both were. Susan's evenings stretched blank and heavy once the kids were asleep. She found herself watching TV shows she didn't even like, just to fill the noise. Michael, in his apartment, sometimes sat with a takeout container cooling beside him, scrolling endlessly on his phone until his eyes blurred. It was Noah, 11 and unguarded, who finally pierced the stalemate. One Saturday, while helping Susan unload groceries, he asked, Mom, do you think you and Dad will ever be together again? Like, really together? Susan froze. Why do you ask that? Because when we're all together, it feels normal. Like before, I like it better that way. She pressed the bag of oranges too tightly, felt the netting dig into her palms. Sweetheart, your dad and I, we care about you and Emma. That won't change, but that's not the same, he said simply, before running upstairs. Susan sat at the kitchen table for a long time afterward, staring at nothing. His words echoed the thought she never let herself voice, that their separation might not be permanent, that what they'd lost might still be recoverable if they were brave, or foolish, enough to reach for it. A week later, during one of their rare face-to-face exchanges, Susan surprised herself. Noah asked me if we'd ever get back together, she told Michael, watching his expression carefully. He didn't laugh or deflect. Instead he looked away, jaw tightening. Emma asked me something similar. She said she wishes we didn't act like strangers. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, the way it used to in their early years, when even arguments carried the electricity of intimacy. Michael finally met her eyes. Do you think we could? He trailed off, but the unfinished question lingered between them. Susan didn't answer, not yet, but the silence was no longer empty. It was full of possibility, dangerous and tender. That night, lying awake, Susan thought of the counselor's office, Emma's raw voice accusing them of hate. Maybe hate wasn't the opposite of love after all. Maybe it was indifference, and despite everything, they hadn't reached that point. Their children still tethered them, but so did something older, something neither of them could entirely kill. The reckoning wasn't about who had been right or wrong. It was about recognizing the cost of what they'd broken, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to rebuild. Winter settled in slowly, draping the town in a quiet that felt less like peace than suspension. For Michael and Susan, the months after Emma's breakdown became a season of unspoken choices. Nothing dramatic happened, no dramatic reconciliation, no single sweeping moment of forgiveness, but their lives began to tilt, almost imperceptibly, back toward each other. It started with dinners. At first, they were logistical. Susan too tired to cook, Michael dropping off takeout when the kids were buried in homework. Then one evening, he stayed. The four of them ate noodles around the scarred oak table, and for the first time in months the silence between bites wasn't jagged. The children noticed before the parents admitted it. Emma lingered longer at the table, eyes bright with a cautious hope she didn't voice. Noah laughed louder, as if testing the strength of the new air. For Michael and Susan, trust returned in fragments. He fixed the leaky faucet one Saturday, careful not to overstay. She asked him to stay for coffee anyway. He apologized, not for everything, but for enough that she could hear it. She, in turn, admitted she had been lonely, that the house felt too large for one person, even with children rattling inside it. There were still arguments, about money, about schedules, about his tendency to retreat and her sharpness when cornered. But the fights no longer carried the same fatal weight. They were disagreements between people imagining a future, not strangers rehearsing the end. By December, Michael was spending more nights at the house than in his apartment. They never announced a decision, they simply lived as though one had already been made. When Emma asked if he was back, he didn't know what to answer. Susan answered for him, "We're trying." Christmas was modest, the tree crooked, the lights slightly tangled. But they strung them together anyway. On Christmas morning, the four of them sat on the rug, unwrapping small, imperfect gifts. Emma squealed over a set of paints, Noah over a second-hand baseball mitt. Michael handed Susan a slim book of poems. She gave him a sweater, too large, but warm. At some point, Susan leaned against him, almost without thinking, her head brushing his shoulder. He didn't move away. They sat like that for a long time, the children bickering over wrapping paper, the house filled with the rare sound of uncomplicated laughter. It wasn't a triumph, it wasn't even certainty, but it was something sturdier than either of them had expected. Not a return to the life they had broken, but the tentative beginning of another, one built not on the illusion of permanence, but on the fragile, daily choice to stay. And for that morning, with snow lightening the windows and the tree glowing faintly in the corner, it was enough.